it's going to work for you.
Okay.
Hello, thank you for coming. My name is Holly Painter. I'm the director of the Center for Research on Vermont, and along with the Silver Special Collections, we are very pleased to have with us Tanya from the Vermont State Archives and Records Administration. I'm not going to say very much about the State Archives because that's Tanya's job today. But Tanya has more than 20 years of experience with our state archives, including almost 14 years in her current role as state archivist and chief records officer. So I think we're in very good hands. I'm happy to turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you very much, Holly. I'm very happy to be here. So I'm Tanya Marshall, State Archivist and Chief Records Officer for the Vermont State Archives and Records Administration. And before I get started, just a little bit of background. As mentioned, I've been actually with the Secretary of State's office, where we're a division, since 2003. And as we walk through the different slides, you'll kind of see the journey that I've been on, because we didn't have the Vermont State Archives and Records Administration when I started with the state. So I'm going to walk through the agenda, and we'll do questions at the end. Does that work well for everyone? Okay, great. So we're going to walk through the Vermont State Archives and Records Administration, which gives everyone an overview, and also how you can reach us and how we got formed. I'm going to talk about government, because we are a government archives, which is different than, say, here, special collections or a library in other settings, but also maybe not as organized as some other areas because it's government. I'm going to talk about archival records within the scope and also research, and then we'll close that. How does that sound? And everyone can hear me, right? Okay. So for context, public record, there's a legal definition, and I know we talked to a couple of folks here who have to follow that exactly. It's any written or recorded information that's produced or acquired in the course of public agency business. And so this is part of our Vermont Public Records Act. And public agency within this act really just means government, or local government, state governments. So public means government. It doesn't mean not confidential. Sometimes people confuse that, thinking public means it's publicly available, it's not confidential. But public in this context within our Public Records Act means government. And so when it comes to the archives or comes to public records, it's anything written or recorded, any format. It's not just about paper or writing on text. It's not just in a book. It's recorded data. It can be a code related to a system, anything that's written or recorded. So our charge as the Vermont State Archives Records Administration is we do two main things. One is we were charged with administering the statewide records and information management program for local and state government. So that includes our municipalities, our counties, which we don't really have too much of a county system in the state of Vermont. And then it also includes state government, and our scope is all three branches, which is super unique to Vermont. Most state archives and records administrations only provide services to the executive branch. We actually provide our full services to the legislative branch and the judicial branch and all of local government. The other part that we have are the management responsibilities in the Vermont Public Records Act, and that includes preserving archival records and also authorizing the destruction of non-permanent temporary records. That means that no one can actually destroy a record in the state of Vermont, this is any written or recorded information, without authorization from the state archivist, which is a huge task. So when we talk about this with new legislators, for example, they're like, this is a sticky note that I just wrote a note on. Is this a public record? Did you write it during the course of business? Yes. Yes, it's a public record. We have different strategies that we do for the statewide records and information management program that allows us to streamline that process, but it is intended to not authorize, essentially you don't want individuals destroying records without some form of approval. Does that make sense? They have it in all states, but it's usually scoped to the executive branch. But this way, we'll talk about the formation a little bit. So we were created in 2008, and I love this slide because it's more about the pictures that tell the story than maybe putting it on text. I'm in the Secretary of State's office. This is the Secretary of State's office in 1926. So Secretary of State is the secretary for the state. So they're in the State House, legislative acts, right? General Assembly comes, pass legislation. Who's going to keep care of it? The Secretary of State. Governor's records in about 1854 became property of the Secretary of State. So this is Secretary of State in 1926. Do you see all these records? We were also the first place when you had to register something or the government decided, well, we should write this down. It should be something kept. It was the Secretary of State. Do you know what the first DMV was? Secretary of State, because all of a sudden you want to put someone on the list to know that they had motor vehicles, right, or a license. So this is us in 1926. This is the Public Records Commission. Around 1937, county court, we don't have county court system anymore, but a county court came forward and said, we're running out of room. What do you do? Are you allowed to destroy a record? In the state and legislature, nobody actually knew, no one had asked. I mean, think about record keeping. It's not about having the ability to go to your computer. It's not the same as it is now. I mean, there weren't even copy machines, mimeographs. We were talking about writing inside big books, and someone has to make a determination about destruction. So in 1937, the legislature decided they'll create the Public Records Commission. And it was comprised of the state officers. So it'd be the Secretary of State, the treasurer. This is them. Look at this picture. Do you see the records in boxes? So we're no longer in recording books anymore at this point. This is in the 70s. And so this is the Public Records Department. So it started as a commission just deciding authorization of destruction, and suddenly became, maybe we need to do some management. We need to start figuring this stuff out. We need to have things stored long-term, but maybe it doesn't need to be right in your state office. These two entities are not part of the Secretary of State's office. They are part of the agency of what is now the Agency of Administration. And so that's the first record center. This picture I really love. I was already at the Secretary of State's office in this picture. This is about 2006. We don't look too different from there, because that was our reference room. The ghosts hear it, I can tell. The lights are going. That was our reference room. That's actually where 3 employees worked. That was our processing room. That's also where members of the public came in to get other services from the Secretary of State's office. And this is actually Dr. Bierman, who's with his students from UVM, scanning for the landscape change program. That is us, and that is where the State Archives was. It is in an old house in 2006 with a basement, with a retrofit vault of 1,500 records. And this was the one workroom that we had. It was a bifurcated system because all the management responsibilities were kind of in this area with the Public Records Department, which by then was really a division underneath Buildings and General Services in the state, which meant it was really just there to move records around and put them in boxes, not so much management at that point. And then the Secretary of State's office was very much trying to get management because in 2003, for the first time, the state of Vermont passed legislation to allow in archives. So think about that. Secretary of State had roles underneath the laws for legislative records and governor's records, and whatever the Secretary of State was charged with, registrations. There was no other place for permanent records. There was no archives. So they passed the law in 2003 that essentially said the Secretary of State can go throughout all of state government and identify records that, quote unquote, are permanent archival public records. I happened to come here. I went to school at University of Maryland, College Park. That's where I got my master's degree. I was in a PhD program there on information science specific to government sector for digital. Like, the cusp of moving into the digital round was where it was. Oh, now I'm off. We have to log back in. Is this boring you?
Not at all.
But in 2003, my husband and I had just decided to relocate to Vermont. And it was because we had 3 small children. And I had left that program for different reasons, for the PhD program, but largely because I was an experimental program. And at that time, you know, at the very end, it was decided that if you're working in government records or information, it wasn't really scholarly work. And it wasn't going to meet the criteria for that particular doctoral program. So we came up here and just random got a phone call from the Secretary of State about 6 months in, it's in November. Very different than the DC area, which we were there for about 6 years, and which was really cold in November, and the kids were all crying. They were 2 and under. I have 3 kids, 2 and under at that point. And they said, hey, we passed this archives law in July, and we have no idea how to do this, and we heard you have some type of background. I had never done this either, per se, but I said, sure, it looks like a great way to get out of the house for 20 hours. And so I came into that environment. And it's been great. Here we are today. We're in Middlesex. That picture that you saw with all the boxes stored, that record center, it got relocated to Middlesex by Department for Buildings and General Services in the 80s and got built. In 2008, the legislature passed legislation to create the Vermont State Archives and Records Administration, so consolidating these 2 different things, management and archives together, because we really focus on a continuum, right? Like the archival records start someplace. You can't wait till the end for this life cycle. And then we added the archival vaults in 2010, becoming the first archival vaults in the state that were really up to par. And then we have a public research room there as well. Of course, statutes and laws are going to come up a lot because we're in the government, and it's part of that accountability and transparency. The management of public records I already mentioned. Legislative clerk, that goes back to our Secretary of State duties. We are the legislative clerk. When a bill is passed by the legislature, we assign the act number. We become the custodian of that particular legislative act after it's signed from the governor. And we also do the publication of the acts and resolves for the state, which is legal. State boards and commissions registry, that was added a couple of years ago. Mainly a misunderstanding. It was perceived that we knew all the appointments of all the state boards and commissions. We didn't. The legislature also thought it knew all the state boards and commissions that it created and realized it didn't. Maybe they had too many of them. So we all came together and I said, you know, we'll go through all the laws, which is part of what we do, to figure out how many boards and commissions you have created that are still existing in the executive branch, because they wanted to sunset some of them. 250 boards later and 3,000 board members. But we managed the registry now, so we're good. Not quite published online yet, but it's good. And then we also have, this one right here is our enabling statute that talks about the statewide records and information management program and all the services that we're required to do underneath that, which we're always happy to do. This other one, 3 VSA 218, is related to state agencies and departments. And VSA stands for Vermont Statutes Annotated, so that's the law. In the executive branch, if you are an agency, like the Agency of Natural Resources, Agency of Transportation, or department, like Department for Children and Families, you are required to have a records management law or a records management program to manage your records. That was added at the same time as the Public Records Act in the 70s. When we took over, nobody knew that law existed. It was never really known. So think about agencies and departments were created, suddenly we have this charge to also help with management. They're not familiar with it at all. And the last one is administrative rules. Just like Code of Federal Regulations, we administer rules. So agencies in the executive branch can establish rules if they have rulemaking authority, and they have the same force of law. And so we administer that whole process between the legislature and the executive branch. We're 20 people total. We were created with 23 in 2008, and we dropped to 14 in February of 2009. There was a big cut of positions across state. Secretary of State's office received 12 of those position cuts and took 9 directly from Visara. So we built them back up to 20, which is great. The legislature has given us quite a few, and Governor Shumlin, as part of the library changes that happened with the Department of Libraries, we took over some functions from the former state library in about 2013. So he provided 3 positions to us from that. The core things that we do is that we're divided into 2 service units, and we also have 2 programs. So the first service unit is kind of the public facing, where people come into our office, they can come in and do research for the archival records. But we also do statutory filings. There's a number of things that come in to the Secretary of State's office that we're the filing office, and they're by statute, by law, that they come to us. So we do that. We do publications. I mentioned the acts and resolves, and also the legislative directory for legislators. Do a number of different reporting. By law, the Secretary of State defines jurisdictions. So the city of Essex Junction was created a couple of years ago. That gets filed and recorded in the Secretary of State's office. We report that to the Census Bureau. So we do a number of different reportings that falls underneath Visara. Record authentications and certifications. We certify vital records. That's a key part of what we do on behalf of the Department of Health, and municipal clerks do too, but we do all of them. Most come through the Vermont State Archives and Records Administration. And we authenticate records for legal use in other countries. So think about that. If you needed to use your birth certificate, or if you had a notarized document, you need to be legal in another country, that comes through the Vermont State Archives and Records Administration to do that. We do that for public records that are certified, have to be Vermont, can't be another state, but also Vermont notarized documents. And that's one unit. And then the State Boards and Commissions Registry. Our whole technical service is about all our operations. So that's the State Archives, Digital Archives, State Record Center. State Record Center is where the records aren't in our legal custody. State Archives is where we take legal custody. We are the legal custodian of those records in addition to physical. And that's where our processing occurs. That's how we do their indexing. That's how I do our whole management around that to make them accessible. And then we have 2 programs. One is the target assistance. This is where we actually work with all those entities. Just gonna do this so it doesn't go off again. Shake that mouse. We set the standards for the state in terms of best practices. We were charged by statute to make sure we're always using industry standards and best practices and adapting them. And then we do services out to local and state government. So we will go out into those offices and actually provide those records and information management services. Often with agencies and departments have a records officer by law, but it's usually a duty as otherwise assigned. So we'll go out there and provide different services that we can do with our team. And then we have the Vermont Historical Records Program. We added that in 2017-18. We get a lot of questions from historical societies and museums throughout the state. And then to get federal funding, it goes through the state archives to do that. And so we wanted to have a sustainable source rather than just have grants, do a project and have it go away, right? So how do you sustain that work even? And so Secretary of State's office added a position for us to have something full-time, and then the legislature did as well. So that person roves, it's a roving archivist program. And then part of that umbrella is access and use of historical records throughout the state and coordinating. For that, coordinate with Erica, who's on our board for the Historical Records Advisory Board. And that's our team of 20. Yes?
Have all of the archives been digitized, or as of now?
Well, we do born digital records, and then we do paper-based. So we'll get into the archives in a second, yeah. Just our core purpose, just to kind of like, this is what we're telling everyone what we do. We preserve, promote, protect, and provide authentic, reliable, and accurate information, right? We're not in the business of fake information, misinformation. We're there to really dispel. And we have our programs and services. And the next part that's really the hub, and this is what we have for agencies, is that for current contemporary records, we're doing strategies and also technologies, right? Record keeping's tough in 2026. It's not those bound books. We thought it was tough when people had to handwrite something, but you're talking about a huge amount of records right now in all different formats. And so our goal is to really simplify it for our agencies and departments and local government and see what we can do with our team of 20 to help with that and use different strategies and technologies around that. We offer the professional assistance and the capabilities statewide. And then this is the key, right? You want to be in the business of providing the right information to the right people at the right time. And that's what we do. So getting into government, because we are scoped on that, and it's part of this past prologue, I wanted to put that in the title today because the National Archives and Records, in addition to Shakespeare, but the National Archives and Records Administration has it on the outside of its building. If you've seen what's happened to the National Archives in the last year, is that all our federal colleagues, and we have a very close relationship with them as the state archives, all the state archives do, that entire team is gone. And I wanted to give that part of the tribute, to them, because the secondary part that comes with it is accountability and transparency. And government is messy. It's really messy. So the first part on it is just knowing that it's contemporary. Everything that's happening right now in our lived experiences are about contemporary time. So context matters when you're trying to look at something through a lens of now and understanding what you're looking at the past. Structures change. I just showed a little example of how we merged and had different, but think about it over time. We're the state archives as well, not just contemporary record keeping, but we have to go back in time. And we had, in 2003, just getting this archives law for the first time, having to make a determination and find and locate and figure out where all these records are located and who these people were who created them. Relationships matter. It's not just siloed, right? It's all intertwined in different ways. So this is kind of my management slide that we do for agencies and departments. So you can put yourself inside that little round if you're doing active records on that. But the key part for us when we do our statewide program for current contemporary record keeping is making sure that all these different obligations, so if you are in an environment in a state agency or any entity of the state right now, you have multiple obligations. You're going to have state obligations that are legal. You're going to have maybe your own industry standards and best practices. You're going to have federal obligations. And then you have to align them to what you're actually doing at that time. And those things don't always match. Maybe the law is old, or maybe it's kind of clunky. We're just talking about the Public Records Act before this started. It's old. It's written in a way that envisioned paper-based records. Or open meeting law, the earlier parts envision different kinds of record keeping. So we talk about common controls with everyone. We talk about visibility and standardization. That's where you get that transparency components really coming out there. And then governance and compliance. And that's where that clarity and consistency and accountability comes from. And these things have to align at the agency level, and people are public servants. They're doing their job and trying their best. So this is our agency slide when we talk about what people are doing now, because we're dependent on them for our ability to preserve permanent archival records, right? We all are part of a team here. So when you think back to 2003 and popped into the Secretary of State's office, and they're like, hey, we have this new law. We have 1,500 boxes of records in the basement of the Redstone building, which is an old summer house. But because we passed this law, you're going to go down to Middlesex to the record center, and there's a vault there. And they said, hey, the vault's there. It's 3,500 boxes, more than we have. Go in there, figure out what we do, and then we'll take custody. And I said, okay, I'll go over there. I go in there. It's a little chaotic in there, so there's different things from different time periods. And this is really the model that had to come out of that, like having to make appraisal decisions. Appraisals when we decide what do we keep, what do we not. And here we're talking about legacy records. This is not in the contemporary. This is not about active record keeping. And the first box I pulled was actually the Secretary of State box, because I thought that would be easier to do. And they're all motor vehicle registrations. And it was like, this doesn't make any sense to me. You all know the DMV is the DMV, which occurred then we have to figure this out because we're going across time. So created this system that's really just based on a few concepts. Legislation, as a government entity, we actually we can't even exist without legislation. They tell us who we are. They tell us what our name is. In legislation, I'm the Vermont, we're the Vermont State Archives and Records Administration. In legislation, they tell us what we do and define it. There's a definition for the statewide records and information management program. What are we doing about it? What's our job here? Oh, we're ministers. Okay, we're administrating. So we actually developed this system because it can go backwards and forward, and we can collect information on any given thing. So if you pull a record like I was down here, those are the things, evidence, right? This is evidence that things are working. If I'm talking to you, it's not being recorded. It's not really written or recorded information, but if I'm writing it down, it's a government record. And so at this point, we can come in anywhere to start figuring out all sorts of things, not only about government itself, but how do we want to manage the records? What's the context here? So for us, this helps us help the agencies and entities now. It also includes helping us. We're the state archives. Can you imagine a situation where the state archivist will come in and just make a decision? I like these records, I'm going to keep them. I don't like these records, I'm going to throw them out. That is not appropriate, right? We're looking at accountability and transparency. This keeps us as archivists also in that round of accountability and transparency. So it's aligned not only with the agencies and what we're expecting, but we're accountable to the same. Passes Prologue. How else are you going to figure out what's going on for our, 250th anniversary for Vermont next year, 250 years of record keeping, 250 years of history, needing to figure out knowledge and understanding as the state archives, but also helping entities right now figure out what they're doing with their current records. We need something that's knowledge and understanding, objective. But I always say to our team, we're not in the business of being any subjectivity. It is about those records as they were at that time. It's about that legislation as it was at the time. We can point people to the right place, get them the right information, but it's not about subjectivity for us. Multifaceted, we also have jurisdictions, people, places, all sorts of things that we add on to this measure that we can go across time and space. Contextualizes the past, gives the context for something. When someone contacts me and says, I don't know, what happened in 1936, what is going on, we're able to put it into this model and really understand and provide that. And that informs the present, which really gets into the archives part. The visual here is that top book. That's 2 years of governor's records, 1940. 43 to 45. Governor Douglas, when he left office, was the last governor with paper-based records, about 150 boxes. Governor Shumlin, when he left office, who was right before current Governor Scott, 3 boxes, 4 terabytes. 1 book, different record keeping, right? Different planning, different skills. But think about this too. We had this book already in the archives. We didn't have other books before that for other sets. So when someone asks us, what do you make a choice on? We've had this standard since the beginning. It's really about looking for core things that determine what's a permanent record. Because if we're determining what's a permanent record, then we're determining what's not. And then we can authorize it for destruction when it's really not needed anymore. So in this case, we're looking at that evidence of persistent legal rights. We're looking at evidence of significant agency policies and procedures. This is internal too. This is that knowledge that happens within the own entity, right? If you're an agency of natural resources, don't you want to know what came before you and how you're operating now? Agencies love to hear it because the average public servant coming into that role, they know what their job is right now, but they don't always know why or how it was done before or why they do things a certain way. We always hear that too, well, we've always done it this way. why. It's very fascinating when we uncover that as to why some things are done. Evidence of agency deliberations, decision actions related to social, economic, political, and environmental issues. Greater part of the population. So we look across that particular, and we're looking at government functions all the time that create certain sets of records. Evidence of significant effects of agency programs and actions on individuals, communities, and I can't even speak right now, natural resources of the state. This is a key part that's come up more recently. We're talking earlier, I think, about foster care. I have a slide about that. That's part of our role. And then we do look at broader scope and not preserved elsewhere. So this will be the one exception where we may take in a record or records that are not government. So if there's something, there's been certain areas where, among the different institutions in the state of Vermont, that it's just not the right fit. So we will take those records in, and our predecessors did on occasion as well, but substantially enrich. Here's our stats. So if you're coming out, right now we're kind of still small, 18,227 boxes or containers of paper records, and analog mean like reel-to-reel cassette tapes. 23,000 reels of microfilm paper records. The state was really big into microfilming until about 2008 because the record center was so overflowing. And there was really no state archives because we also didn't have a vault. So for many generations, it was just make it smaller. Doesn't make it more easy, but it made it smaller. So we have a lot, and this is just the archives. For the State Record Center, we're about 80,000. But look at the increase since 2008. So that's when we were created as Visara. Since 2003 was when they passed the archives law. So that was the increase because we got that extra that vault there. This is our digital. 16.64 terabytes, which isn't that lot, except the legislature transitioned from paper-based to electronic, fully digital after COVID. 7 terabytes each biennium, which is every other year coming in. They're our largest transfer. As mentioned, we serve the legislature as well, and increase. So we're budgeting out, and that's the majority of things that we're bringing in now from different state agencies and departments. Paper-based, we have about 100,000 banker boxes worth across the state. About 85,000 are probably in the record center already. We're doing sweeps of every single courthouse. So we're the one place that you can go for court paper records. Legislative records are all there already. State agencies and departments, just a few left. And then we know what we're looking at for paper records. And you think about it too, it's really hard. Like, no one wants to throw out a book. I know I'm working, my predecessor, Gregory Sanford, wonderful man, he keeps sending me messages to say, hey, I got all these old legislative, acts. I have all these old copies and I don't want to throw them out, but it's like, we do have to throw it. So it's kind of, when you see a paper box, you're kind of like, maybe I should call somebody, talk about it. Our agencies and departments now, municipalities call, but I mean, you see it too in the light. But digital, it's so much and so much not needed, but it's so fleeting. And that's what I worry about. So when we get to the end, I'll talk about what keeps me up at night. So research. Who has been to the State Archives and Records Administration? So on our webpage, it'll tell you how to get in to come do research at the State Archives. And we're open, meaning like you don't have to make an appointment, but it's always easier to not catch us off guard and come in and say, hey, I wanted this huge research project to do. So we always have information available on our website. And what you can come into, and this is these are just examples of different sets of records, but I really want to emphasize is that because we look at everything from so many different angles, it doesn't matter what you come to us asking. If you only know if you only know like an entity, like you're like, hey, I heard about this like board that was in 2001, or I heard about this thing that existed in 1909, bring it. We have that whole system that we track every single entity in state government that's ever created since the beginning of time. And then the other part of it, looking backwards and forwards, we can help explain the public policy decisions or the organizational structure or whatever you might be looking for if it is specific on that agency, but it doesn't need to be. This just happens to be the agency of administration. So it's talking about, like, this is what they look like in 1968. Every 5 or 6 years or in the new administration, they all say, hey, we should look at how we're organized, right? So right now, this is their website, also permanent record of this, or we'll scrape part of it to save that, but digital format. But the going back and forth and understanding accountabilities, understanding transparency, understanding structure. Here's examples of all different records in the archives, but it doesn't need to be a record to just know that it exists. So come in through that portal. Government functions. We have a lot of requests on government functions, but we talk about it in the contemporary, right? Someone will come in and say, I'm looking for Agency of Transportation records from 1820. Do you have them? Well, Agency of Transportation didn't necessarily exist, but what are you specifically looking for? I'm looking for how highways might have been built, or what the town road looked like, or how we did infrastructure at that time that was building. That's all we need to know. And we're going to be able to go backwards and forwards and find that and help anybody who's doing research on that area, if it's about a functional area at the same time, and help them go back and forth too. May not have the records, but there's enough information within there from other sets of records with legislative or other structural. This is an example of, in 1992 on the left is this huge map of trying to understand government functions that were done for part of an information project, wanting to build on mainframes. So they wanted to have common systems. This is just an export from one of our systems, the V-Class system that just runs real fast. So I ran it for the slide just to show, because you can see different areas here. You can see where some of these are all set by statute, these terms, but there's many different layers to who works in any particular environment too. So we have, for example, areas of tobacco products. Different people in different parts of the, state agencies work on them, not just the one that maybe regulates it. It's really fascinating to be able to look at government across time and understand the context that they were working under and how it helps inform to next steps. Tobacco control, liquor control, think about cannabis. Took it right from the playbook from liquor control. The laws are very the same. They had to go back in time and find the first time they regulated something like that when they passed the cannabis laws in the state of Vermont. Acts. We probably spend a lot of time mostly in acts, only because it provides the most context. It's what the legislature has passed. It's what entities they formed. It's what functions they wanted. This happens to be related to, this is actually a bill I testified on a couple of weeks ago related to fraudulent deeds. Fraudulent deeds on land, transactions is a big issue right now in the state of Vermont and other states, and we're doing a modernization project for real property records and data that are statewide with municipalities. The very first act passed by, even before we were a state, in 1787, one of the first ones related to deeds and town clerks, who still record them. We're the only state. We have 246 recorders for land records in the state because we don't really have county. And does anyone see what it says for preventing? For preventing fraudulent deeds. How far have we gone to have, this one doesn't have that word on the screenshot, but it is about fraudulent deeds. 1784, 2026, still an issue, not yet solved, touching the same statutes. And so for all of them, they all have their own genealogy, just the same way that someone might do research on their family. Public agencies have their own genealogy. Government functions have their own genealogy. Talking about legislative acts, own genealogy. They're fascinating if you're like a government record geek like I am, but if you're doing other research too, it really helps inform. Transactions, those are the ones that we all think about right away. That's where the records get created. This is just an example of the different town reports required by law. But the idea is you can go back and forth in any particular area. There's certain parts, like if you're trying to do space, maybe we don't have too much on that. Maybe we do. If you're trying to do anything related to physically standing in a space in Vermont, walking down a street, walking into a building, thinking about a public policy topic, anything, and you can go backwards and forwards. It's fascinating. In addition to what we have in the archives, we also have things online. And so there's an area that you can go onto our page that we'll talk about. Ancestry.com is one of our partners, and newspapers.com. Ancestry is currently finishing up naturalization records. So for the gentleman about digitization, what we do is we partner with online content providers. They do not charge the state of Vermont any money for this. It's a mutual exclusive kind of, we have a good mutual beneficial relationship on that. It provides free access to Vermonters, or as long as you're inside the Vermont boundary, you go to this page, you type in your zip code, it will pass you through to the site, and then we have even more access to these sites. So we're an open vital record state, for example, so that's part of the Ancestry right now. They're finishing up new naturalization records related to the state, when the states used to naturalize before 1909. And then the newspapers, which I think is one of the best things that we have, because it puts it all together for, I call it the V-class wheel, right? We saw that little design they had, like this is a linchpin because everything else is government created. This is the contemporary view of the public and others at any given time. And newspapers of record, the first publisher, because we didn't have state printers, we didn't have state publishers, were newspapers, and the Secretary of State's role from the beginning of statehood was to decide which newspapers would publish the government information. How would we get communications out to citizens that a new law had passed? How would we get information? And so the government printers were the newspapers, and they're called newspapers of record. The Department of Libraries, underneath a statute that was repealed, I think we did in 2017, because newspapers of record, mostly we can get it through digital form, so it's a little, they didn't need to get paper copies. But underneath law, especially after the Government Printing Act that went for Gov Docs, we all know from library world, they had to get a copy of every single issue and preserve it, of all newspapers of record. And so they microfilmed them. And guess who digitized all of them? Newspapers.com. If you come into our office, you can see all of them, but because of copyright, they're not available necessarily online. They'll just do certain, but we have a number of publishers now that are coming to us in Vermont who want to have this level of access, and if they come underneath our agreement, even if they're not a newspaper of record, newspaper will, if it's microfilmed already, they'll accept it, they'll pass it through, allow it through the public portal, and you can go on and search, and it becomes part of the state archives permanent. So that's an enriching part where it's not necessarily a record that was government, in this case, government received, because the Department of Libraries was charged by the law to receive a copy. This just happens to be, and this is why it's a good visual, I picked this one. That's inside our facility. That's our record center. Most of the things are turning over to the archives right now, but that is actually just one bay of our record center, which is 2 stories high and about, 2 football fields length, just the record center. And it was key for us to build the State Archives vaults on the outside of that record center because my predecessor worked for 30 years to get those vaults, and he just got vault space for 2,500 boxes. So we knew it wasn't going to happen anytime soon, but we could retrofit the record center once it flipped, and it has. So most of state government is now all digital. That's why we're doing that last sweep. That means pretty much this whole facility, which is about 130,000 boxes ability, will become the full state archives, and we have the capacity. But newspapers, going back to that, this is a great article because it talks about the number of different kinds of research that people have been doing since we finally were able to be built, and they're coming in through the past and understanding context. So it's a great thing about Gary Shattuck, who's also done some research and a great visual. This is something that we do with our team, and it's also just to explain context. It says chain, authenticate, and verify, but it's really about chain of custody. If you think about in the past, in the paper world, we're pretty good at being able to determine chain of custody because, and it's a key part. I wouldn't want, you say, Megan over here to start handing me some records and saying, hey, I got these out of my attic. I'm pretty sure they're public records. You should take them. And I'm just like, hey, so chain of custody is a really key part. We get it directly from the creator. Because we're a big record center state and it had so much or put on microfilm, we don't really have a lot of chain of custody issues. But right now, when you think about chain of custody, authenticate, and verify, there's a lot with digital. So just think about that context. And I use this slide because we get asked to testify a lot on context and understanding if we actually have valid, accurate, authentic, and reliable records. And we do this process when we testify to legislature, really explaining to them, like the testimony is mine in the background, but then we use the different documents and we explain the chain of custody and we explain the documentation behind it. And oftentimes it's because they're trying to understand the past to make policy decisions for now. This is a more recent one. This is legislative reports. In this case, this was a couple of years ago, and it was a call actually from Senator Pearson when he was senator out of Burlington. And at the end, they had passed this new legislation that a lot of other states were doing to ensure that individuals who had been adopted had access to their records, including their original birth certificate. And then at the very nth hour, the legislature, they realized there was a loophole in the law and they didn't understand why. And if you had been in foster care and adopted, you had access. If you had been in foster care and not adopted, you didn't. And so I say end up because it was really like 6 o'clock in the evening, getting a call on the last day of the session saying, can the archives do research and help us understand why we have these existing laws that say no access? And also, where can we make a change and how do we do this and where are all these parts? And so we did a report. We did it with the Department for Children and Families and other individuals. And, we were talking about really going through the past and understanding context and researching. This was one area that had hundreds, and I'm not exaggerating, hundreds and hundreds of laws going back to the original statehood, which explained a whole lot of different things related to sealing of records or birth certificates, a lot of things related to judges and how they handled certain cases, a lot of things related to adoption and why it wasn't necessarily for the goodness of the child. It was it was a lot. But at the end, because we're able to do this tracing and this genealogy around the laws as well, identified just 2 laws that just needed at least one sentence structure change. And so they took that up, and of course it ended up with a lot more changes, which we intended, but just finding 2 laws for that. And so in June of 2024, Governor Scott signed that bill, and that opened up foster care for the first time. And it really showed the ability to go look through the past, understand what we needed to do from a public policy, or at least make recommendations, right? And my job is it's just to show the legislature why in context, and a path forward should they make a policy decision or want to. So I'm gonna go back to this slide real quick because I only have 2 left. This is about current contemporary. Remember when I talked about this, about how we work with public agencies right now? The thing that keeps me up at night when we were the Secretary of State and it was divided public records, right? It wasn't great. You had management on one side, you had the archives on the other. We have a new complete separation. And if it doesn't come together and doesn't come together fast, we have a future that may not include the same level of archival research available that we have right now. It is easy in the state of Vermont to find the paper-based records. We know where they are, they exist, we brought most of them in, we're working with municipalities and the town clerk's offices. They weren't really going anywhere, they weren't necessarily authorized for destruction. Right now, there's getting to be a bigger divide between thinking that information from a technology perspective or a management perspective are two different things, and they're not. We're in an information economy right now. Think about everything is about information. Everything is about digital. And the more that these are separated, not only does it become a risk for our current contemporary public agencies on managing information because they're relying on technology, right? But also, if technology is misaligned with the management requirements, then we're also not getting that compliance, that accountability, even if it's something the agency isn't intending to not happen. And I look at, the opportunities that we have that we don't have in the paper world. And the information that we have that's digital, that's still locked and sealed, not intentionally like a law, but the inability to kind of use that information to help inform current even operations within an agency, right? So many people retire. Think about federal government and number of the workforce that's left in the last year. That's institutional knowledge. There's abilities that we can be using to be really strong in that knowledge area and help, even train some aspects of it. But if these two things remain divided, and they are right now in the state of Vermont and other places, all this unification parts, they're more complicated than they ever were even 25 years ago, are all happening simultaneously right now with current records. And so our statewide records and information management program is really designed to think about contemporary current records and putting them on a pathway. And we can't wait. That's one of the distinctions. You don't wait anymore for an archive. You don't wait for like, oh sure, bring me your paper records 30 years later. There's no such thing as waiting. We actually embed our preservation services right now into active current records. We embed them right in sync. A lot of people might use Microsoft 365. That's synchronized. But from a leadership standpoint, or that it's still within the state perceived as technology is here. Oh, information professionals, archivists, records managers, they're there. And there's really no separation. So that really keeps me up at night because I worry about the state not having information. So that is the end. I hope it helped everyone know what we do or try to do every day, but I'm happy to take questions or comments or.
I immediately have a question about, we were talking a little bit about.
Do you want to use the microphone?
I'll use the microphone. So my name is Megan Rourke. I'm with CCTV, one of 24 public access centers that are recording meetings, local government meetings and other events. And archiving those is really important to us. And I just wonder how that relates to what you talked about. These are kind of non-archival records of not only the decisions that are being made, but the way those decisions that are being made, right? It's for me one step up from a minute taking. So I wonder if you just talk a little bit about what do you think of that, and where does that role? What's the role of the state archivist in preserving those?
So the question is related to that you're filming and recording public meetings right now underneath the open meeting law, but it's not done on behalf of like a government sector, right? But there's opportunities, right? So what I would say about that one is think about our online content providers. So we talked about ancestry and newspapers. In our agreement with them, we own that. I'm not taking those records actually into our repositories right now because they run their own preservation activities and we're happy with that. If they fold, if they leave or something happens, then we will take those records back. But right now it's a very cost-effective measure. So I would say for something of that nature is that if there's already someone recording, it can be looked at as an online content provider with those agreements in place. Now, the long-term preservation, it really depends on the minutes, and so when we take in legislative video, and I was talking to Holly, because she's on a board that falls underneath that too, the legislature used to do paper-based minutes, or textual minutes, I should say. And when recording came about in the 70s, decided, as others did, including municipalities and other boards and commissions in the state, that they would record to hear it and play it back to write your textual minutes. That lasted 2 years. And then the legislature decided not to take textual minutes anymore, only audio, and now audio visual, right? So that is the permanent record because it is nothing more than the minutes. The long-term preservation of video, when there's a textual minute requirement, I would still go for the textual minutes because I can tell you from the video and all the people coming in trying to do research, because we're a legislative intent state, and you have to know what the word meant and what they thought that word meant when they put in the law at that time. No one wants to be all real to real. However, it's all what makes the most benefit, right? So if you're offering that service, I think the online content provider kind of agreement, if that entity is really looking, that's a win-win, mutual beneficial situation, at least for the terms for the recording. Does that help answer?
Yeah, it's an expensive endeavor.
It is. Yeah, I know. Well,
When you're preserving, when you're downloading those recordings that are uploaded to YouTube or not downloading, when you're preserving those, I mean, is that part of that terabytes?
yeah, we get a full transfer directly from the General Assembly after the biennium.
Okay.
Yeah.
It must be compressed.
Pardon?
It must be compressed.
They're MP4s. Yeah. But that's how we also don't modify. So like we do operate a digital preservation system, which shows that we're able to take that directly, preserve and lock down that particular record, but then we can manifest in different ways. But they do create them as, we receive them as MP4s, and part of our role is not to change and modify the record, but we will preserve that one. And as technologies change, which we do, that system allows us to render it and provide readability in a different format as things happen. But most of our audio, except for the last few years when they changed over during COVID, but there are no textuals. So that's part of the transcript question. And we can run transcripts, but they're not really giving us transcripts. So we're working through the next stage of whether or not we run those transcripts, but be an added record, but not a legislative record. Think about that way. Yep. There you go.
Are records available for researchers on the subject of court-ordered or administrative hearing-ordered involuntary sterilizations that occurred in Vermont about 100 years ago?
Yeah. Yes. So we were able to locate 2 boxes of sterilization certificates after the law passed in 1931. They had been in the custody of our Department of Corrections, which its predecessor was the Department of Institutions. So we don't have them digitized because of privacy, and they're exempt. The names are exempt. However, we do have an index for those that release. So we use the Privacy Act underneath HIPAA to make those determinations. And because it's an open vital record state, we do publish the names of the individuals after 50 years of death and have that available. So if you have, if someone's doing research on that, they can contact our reference room and we'll be able to provide you information for any certificates that we've released underneath that. It's 251 certificates. Yeah. And one of the slides that I had up here was related to testifying, and it shows an example of one of those certificates with redaction. And so then we hit the time frame that we'll have to make determinations. But if we've been able to uncover anything that we can make available to the public, we have done that. Yeah, I can show like a little, whoops, the wrong slide. I'll just skim over. This one right here. This one right here, they were all the pre-printed forms. This is a sterilization certificate. And so what we've done is because we did it for the legislature as well that needed information, is that we did compile all the information and we did tracing back. Part of it to understand what we could release based on that standard that we're following for that. And because they are exempt, they're considered to be medical records, which are exempt underneath the Public Records Act from public inspection and copying. But we tracked and traced individual doctors, individual families. The newspapers allowed us to build a picture, and then some of the testimony which is available on this, and being able to go through newspapers at the time too, which told a little bit more of the contextual story behind some things. We're able to provide information to the legislature about individuals subject to that in the situation behind that. So it is part of the larger legislative concerns. Thank you for asking for that question.
Thank you for being here. You mentioned just in passing the roving archivist program.
Yeah.
I just would love for you to talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So Rachel Ona came from Massachusetts and started the Massachusetts Roving Archivist program, and we were very fortunate to bring her into Vermont at 2017. So the Roving Archivist program, we have a roving archivist who actually works for Rachel now, and that is anyone who calls who has historical records. Doesn't matter if it's a historical society, museum, corporation, family. One can get services from the roving archivist. We will go out to site. We'll also provide different training throughout. I know this weekend is the Sharon, and Sharon on Saturday is the, they have a special name now, I'm blanking on it, but scanning your family records. There's Sharon-based history, and so our roving archivist will be out there. So it does she does a number of different programming, workshops. It can be hosted anywhere too, and we love to collaborate. That's where we do with other entities, is figuring out statewide programming for that sustainability. And it's been a great resource. We've been running that program now pretty much full time since 2019. Yeah, thank you for asking. Yes?
You guys also have records from before Vermont was a state of the Union? So like that in between?
Yes.
When we,
yeah. So the records, so we have one is that we, in the 70s, were able to get duplicate copies from New York, what is now New York for that part. And then there's two counties, Gloucester County and Cumberland County, whose court records we actually have in the archives. So the oldest record that we have in the archives right now is around 1764-ish. So it just depends on what exists from that, and if it's another institution. But yeah, we do. Yeah. I mean, that one law I showed you was from 1784. So, it goes before 1791 as well. Yes.
They follow up.
Yeah.
I had a relative several decades ago, deceased, who had several admissions to Waterbury Psychiatric Hospital. Would dates of admission and discharge be a matter of record and available?
So the question has to do with the Vermont State Hospital and Waterbury. So we have all the existing records from that remained after the floods in 2011 in the state archives. Depending on the time frame, so if they're still subject to the exemptions, meaning they're not available for public access or inspecting underneath the Public Records Act because of privacy concerns like medical, they would not be available. However, there are, depending on the time frame, they might be. But we do have what's remaining after the flood is in the state archives.
They would include dates of admissions and dates of, obviously not medical treatment records. But
Right. Right now, the exemption on is medical related in general. So just knowing that someone was admitted was not something that we can disclose. However, it doesn't mean that you can't find information. So that law, that again, I go back to the newspapers. Exemptions didn't really come in until after 1931, and then more progressively in the 40s and 50s for different reasons and good reasons. But anything that was before that, it would have been maybe published in the paper. That was not uncommon. And so depending on the time frame, if you were to go to our site, if you use, or you call us, we can help do that. You don't have to go to the website. We can certainly trace down different information. If it was part of a census record, depending on the time frame, it would show up inside the census records that they've been released if it's more than 75 years. It will show up inside, oftentimes, town reports. Those are the annual reports. I showed the example on there. There was certain information for each town that would be published about where their residents resided at that particular time if it was not within the town. So there's other ways to find information too.
when you refer to census records, referring to US Census records,
Yes.
none of which I believe are available prior to 1950.
Right, you can only do 1950 and earlier right now. Yes.
I had one, just.
Yeah.
If sticky notes are part of public record of text messages, legislative text messages?
Yes, everything that's written, well, this is where the nuances and some of the branch description comes from in public agency. Yes, so government record, if you want to use that definition, which is what we do, is that anything written or recorded in the course of government business is a government record. And the Public Records Act was originally passed in the 70s, really related to the executive branch. And then the following year, they added the string that includes branch in the definition of public agency and instrumentalities and others of the state. Depending on the information, I think that the latest might be that within the legislature, each legislator is a public agency of themselves. So I think that's the latest that I have. So if you were looking for a sticky note or text message of a legislator, that would be the entity that you would contact directly.
Contact them.
If you're doing a Public Records Act request, yes. And that's only because I read, from the news that was something that came up last year related to who owns the records of that. The Supreme Court, through a ruling in 2018, actually, I don't even know how to say it, but kind of exempted its own self from the Public Records Act, and had made a determination that there was a separation on branch. So like if a court record came into the executive branch, it suddenly became an executive record. I mean, I only report what the laws say. There's, that's our objective part of it is I consider things inside the state archives to be a court record and a judicial record, but so there's different parts of how that public agency is written. We do have information on our website. There's a Learn section that talks about the Public Records Act and actually gives links to legislation, explain like this is where that word came from. You may not, it provides the context for that time of what that was meant. And the branch one has come up a couple of times since I have been at the state. Yes.
Is in-person public access on a walk-in basis, or one has to make an appointment to visit the Middlesex facility?
You do not need to make an appointment. Yes, you can come in at any time. We're open from 9 to 4, Monday through Friday. Depending on what you're looking for, if you call in advance or contact us, we can certainly look ahead and provide those records. We also provide records. We do copy requests. We provide email, but you're welcome to come in. You do not need to make an appointment. Yeah, our team would be happy to help. We have a great reference team. Well, great. Well, thank you all so much. And I'll be here afterwards if there's anything else. And I really appreciate Holly for inviting me and for everyone for coming. And thank you so much. This has been great.
Thank you all for coming. Please help us with the food.
Thank you.